What do they do if you need emergency surgery, but you've already eaten? I know that for scheduled surgeries, they tell you not to eat or drink anything for a while so you don't throw it up or choke to death while in surgery. But what do they do if you go to the hospital and need to be operated on right away, but you've just had dinner or something? They operate anyway, if it's that much of an emergency. My gallbladder went septic, and I was rushed to the hospital 2 hours after dinner. Shortly after that I was in surgery. If your life is at risk, suddenly aspirating food into your lungs is less of a threat than whatever is killing you. Been there. You tell them when you've eaten last so they're aware of it. And then you have the surgery. Anesthetic nurse here. Woman raising hand. In cases like this we do what's called a rapid sequence induction. Intubation. Pressure is put on your neck to prevent food coming up just before you're given the anesthetic. Drugs that put you to sleep. A very fast-acting muscle relaxant is given with the stuff that knocks you out. Then the ET tube is passed through the trachea. The pressure on the neck is released once the tube airway is secured. Other things can be done like giving anti-sickness meds beforehand too. Or if the surgery can be done with a spinal anesthetic where the patient is wide awake, that's also an option too. Had an emergency C-section after suffering from a placental abruption at 35 weeks. Baby only had a few minutes to live, so they were racing to get me to sleep. I had eaten about an hour before, so they pushed on my throat before I went fully under. Absolutely terrifying when you're panicking and then someone is practically choking you. Not to mention the OB started making his incision before I was out, so I felt the initial cut. Most traumatic experience of my life. Baby just turned one smiling face. I'm sure a professional could answer better. But it's essentially risk versus reward health-wise. Which is really going to be something they're considering across the board in an emergency surgery situation. The anesthesia can very rarely cause asphyxiation, choking on your own vomit. Which is why they tell you not to eat or drink. It's not that it's super common, though it's not that rare. I'm not telling anyone to consume anything against DR's orders. Lol. If they're doing surgery, it's because the reward is deemed worth the risks involved. ETAI mixed up words and meant aspiration rather than asphyxiation. We won't hesitate to drop an NG tube and vacuum out your stomach if necessary. Your friendly local emergency medical professional. Rapid sequence induction. They give you anti-nausea meds along with the anesthesia, watch over you, and then do the surgery. One of the reasons they don't want food in your stomach is the chance that the anesthesia drugs will nauseate you. The nausea meds help lessen that. If your surgical need is truly emergent, that's more important than the chance you might vomit and aspirate. Spouse is an anesthesia provider. I've asked him this question before because I was also curious. I'm an anesthesiologist. We typically do a modified anesthetic induction that minimizes the time between when someone becomes unconscious and when we protect the airway with a breathing tube. It's only to make sure you don't have food come back up into your airway while you're under anesthesia and you choke to death. They would just take extra caution. I had an unscheduled C-section. It was an emergency but not a super emergency. So we could wait. Heavily monitored. I was prepped, readied, and then they watched everything carefully. If the baby would have exhibited any stress, we would have done it anyways. But fortunately I had an appointment at the start of the issue. Not quite answering your question, but I recalled this today. When I was getting my emergency C-section, I was so relieved from the spinal that I asked for something to eat. The nurse had to say, "You're literally open on the operating table right now. So no food yet." They finally gave me a popsicle in recovery. I had a grape popsicle in one hand and my baby in the other. It was glorious. You can aspirate on an empty stomach too. I had a transplant and awoke on a vent. Gagged and vomited on the vent. They had to clean me up and get it out ASAP. Was traumatic for sure. If it's a big enough problem, they can put a tube into your stomach and suction it out. They've got some small and some really huge tubes. When some people overdose on a bunch of pills, they can remove some pill fragments that way. If the consequences of not waiting 6-8 hours outweigh the consequences of the possibility of aspiration, then they proceed with surgery. They'll operate anyway. I just had some snacks before my uterus ruptured, and the surgeon didn't even ask when the last time I had food was. When I woke up, I hurled into a bag and then asked for grapes. I'm still alive. Depends on the situation. They might put a tube down your throat and suction out some of your gastric contents. Or they might just have to take you back to the OR and hope for the best. They pump you stomach, been there, did that, not fun. We shove a tube down your throat and try to suck up as much crap as possible so you don't aspirate on. Vomit while you're asleep and someone is holding pressure on your cricoid to help from throwing up. During intubation, the risk for aspiration is much higher. But if the risk of death is more, we would rather deal with the potential of aspiration than coding someone on the table. I was in hospital and there was a question if I would have an emergency C-section, but got told the next morning it was decided to wait and to proceed with breakfast. An hour later I had another drive tell me they had changed their minds and was going to proceed that day. Had to tell them bread was alliance hour ago. So the anesthetizer came round and gave me a satchel to consume. I was warned it was bitter, so consume it fast. Instead it tasted like plasticine instead. But still most unpleasant. Think of consuming pink Play-Doh in liquid form, if you will. I work in a level 1 trauma in the OR. At my hospital we don't gaff about your food intake status if your face has been degloved by the headrest of the seat in front of you in a car accident. Or your leg was torn off when you crashed your motorcycle. Or you're having an active brain bleed. We go to town. Do the cricoid pressure so you don't regurgitate during intubation if you didn't come in intubated from the ambulance or Aeromed and get you out of our OR alive. They tell you that for scheduled surgeries, in order to make the probability of a successful operation with no complications as high as possible, the more potential complications they can eliminate, the better the chance of success. In the case of an emergency surgery, they are doing what they can in the situation they are in, and they simply deal with the complications as best they can. They operate anyway. I had an emergency C-section and had eaten before I went in and then went into labor very quickly. It went better than my scheduled C-section. Woman shrugging, light skin tone. I followed the rules and still threw up for that. 1. There are pro-motility, gastroprotectants, and antiemetics they can give if it's not contraindicated with the emergency. But even anti-nausea medication can't prevent passive regurgitation from being under anesthesia. The no-eating rule is mostly to prevent regurgitation and aspiration pneumonia when you're anesthetized or recovering from surgery. If it's an emergency, they'll compensate for it and do it anyway. If it can't wait, better to work through the small extra risk of throwing up and choking than just letting you die anyway because you need to digest mom's spaghetti. If the surgery isn't critical where doing it now or tomorrow won't make a difference, then it's best to do the fast because that gives you the optimal situation for it. But obviously, not letting you die would be more optimal than surgery with full stomach. TLDR, measure the risk. Are going to die now if you don't do the surgery. Are you going to be the same if we do it tomorrow instead of today? Fast first.